They say man began in caves, that we were primitive, that we grunted in shadows and drew pictures on rock. But if that's where humanity began, why is it that the light, true light, was already shining somewhere else? They leave out the sun. While caves were cold and narrow, the Nile stretched wide and deep. The people of the sun were building with stone when others were surviving with sticks. And yet, the narrative tells us civilization came after the cave. That law, mathematics, philosophy, all emerged from those who barely survived winter. But truth doesn't ask for approval. Kemet, what they now call Egypt, was not some offshoot of progress. It was progress. The pyramids stood when others still hunted to eat. Geometry wasn't invented to draw lines. It was born to align temples with the heavens. They say the Greeks gave us philosophy, but the Greeks sat at the feet of African priests in temples older than their gods. They call them mystery schools. But the only mystery is why the world pretends they didn't exist. Zeno, the father of Stoicism, didn't pull his wisdom from thin air. He traveled. He studied. And where did he go? Egypt. He learned of Ma'at, balance, order, truth. The idea that life isn't ruled by impulse but guided by divine harmony. That discipline is sacred. That emotions are to be mastered, not followed. Doesn't that sound like Stoicism? Yet textbooks say Stoicism began in Greece. Like the Nile didn't already carry that truth from source to sea. Like Africans didn't already teach restraint, not out of weakness, but out of strength. The sage in Kemet was stoic before the word existed. He was calm when chaos erupted. He was silent when noise demanded attention. He was rooted when the world tried to sway him. So, when they talk about painting in caves, remember, some were navigating stars. When they say they invented law, remember, others were writing legal codes before their alphabets existed. When they celebrate the first pyramids in Mesopotamia, remind them, Djoser's stepped pyramid had already kissed the sky centuries earlier. This isn't a game of who was first. It's a question of why the erasure. Why is Africa only credited with rhythm, not reason? With dance, not doctrine? With passion, not principle? Because the story they tell makes you forget who you are. And that's why John Henrik Clarke told us, read their books. Not because they're gospel, but because they reveal themselves. A cave painting is evidence, but what's buried in the sand is proof. They found surgical tools in tombs, they found dental records, they found water clocks and star charts, they found papyrus with wisdom older than Aristotle. But it doesn't fit the image, it breaks the myth. So they teach you to admire the cave and forget the sun. But it doesn't fit the image. It breaks the myth. So they teach you to admire the cave and forget the sun. Because once you remember the sun, you remember yourself. Once you remember the sun, you start asking questions. You start looking past the curriculum. You start recognizing that what they called ancient mystery was just African memory. And that's dangerous. Not because it's violent, but because it's clarifying. Because when a man knows his origin, he can't be manipulated by someone else's version. That's what Dr. Clarke meant when he said, read their books, not to believe them, but to see what they left out. Because buried in the footnotes, lost in the language, and twisted in the framing, lies the truth. They say early man was primitive, that civilization was accidental, that progress was European. But you don't align pyramids to the stars by accident. You don't build monuments that last 4,000 years without math, science, and spiritual order. Kemet didn't guess. Kemet knew. And while they were drawing on cave walls, our ancestors were carving stone with precision. While they were running from animals, our people were cataloging the constellations. While they were surviving, we were thriving. The Stoic doesn't just stand still. He stands in something, in principle, in memory, in alignment. Because emotion isn't evil, but it's not meant to lead. That's why the Stoic doesn't respond to chaos with more chaos. He doesn't let impulse write his story. He doesn't lash out when disrespected. Because he knows what's sacred. He knows what's worth protecting. And most of all, he knows who he is, and who he is goes back farther than they're willing to admit. The Greeks copied the form, but missed the essence. They turned discipline into theory. We lived it as truth. They turned balance into debate. We called it maat and built civilizations with it. They worshipped gods they renamed. We honored netshare, forces of nature, reflections of spirit. Not deities, but principles. We didn't pray to lightning. We studied it. We respected it. We lived in harmony with it. So, when they teach you that philosophy began in Athens, ask them why Pythagoras had to study in Kemet for over 20 years before he could even speak in their temples. Ask them why Plato wrote about Atlantis with descriptions that sound suspiciously like Nile Valley civilizations. Ask them why so many early Western thinkers were either taught in Africa or banned from it. Because the knowledge wasn't lost. It was guarded, protected, and later, whitewashed. And that's why they love the cave. Because the cave doesn't challenge power. The cave makes it look like we were all equal in ignorance. But we weren't. And once you see that, you never unsee it. You start to walk different, think different. Protect your peace like your ancestors protected scrolls. Speak like your words are spells. Move like your energy is sacred, because it is. Peace isn't passive, it's power. It's not silence because you have nothing to say. It's silence because you already know. And when you know, you don't need to prove. You don't need to perform. You don't need to react. That's the trap of this age, performance. Everybody chasing validation. But our ancestors didn't perform. They preserved. They preserved truth through rhythm, through ritual, through restraint. So when a man chooses not to lash out, when he lets the storm rage while he stays centered, that's not indifference, that's inheritance, because he's not empty, he's full of remembrance. Remembrance of a time when the measure of a man wasn't how loud he could speak, but how still he could be in the middle of fire. Remembrance of a time when logic wasn't cold. It was sacred. When emotion wasn't demonized, but disciplined. And this world doesn't want you to remember that. Because a man who remembers reclaims. He reclaims his time, his spirit, his energy, his direction. Because he knows emotion will lie to you. Tell you to speak when you should reflect. Tell you to fight when you should observe. Tell you to burn the bridge when you're just being tested. But the Stoic, the true Stoic, sees through the fog. He knows some battles are distractions, some debates are traps, some responses only lower your vibration. He doesn't avoid the world. He moves through it like a shadow with structure. You think Kemet was just sand and stone? Kemet was philosophy carved in limestone. It was spirituality written in geometry. It was God expressed as order. And what is Stoicism, if not the art of divine order within the self? The Greeks came and saw the temples. They took notes. They studied. They learned from a people who had already been living it for centuries. But then they went back and claimed it, changed the names, shifted the narrative, erased the teachers, and positioned themselves as the source. But you can't rename the Nile and expect it to flow differently. Truth don't change because you branded it. Spirit don't shrink because you packaged it. And this is why we speak now, why this generation must return. Not just to culture, but to principle. Not just to pride, but to practice. Because knowing where you're from isn't just a fact, it's a frequency. It tunes how you speak, how you act, how you respond. That's the test. Because the world will always provoke you, will always challenge you, will always push your buttons to see if you know where they are. But when you know yourself, The buttons stop working. You can't be baited when you're grounded. You can't be lured when you're aligned. You can't be shaken when you know what's real. That's why the Stoic isn't passive. He's present, fully aware, fully anchored. Not cold, just clear. And clarity. That's the weapon they never see coming. Because they expect chaos. They expect noise. They expect you to react like they would. But when you don't, when you remain still, they realize you're not playing their game. You're playing your own. And that's the legacy of Kemet. Not just temples and tombs, but a whole way of life built on restraint, respect, and rhythm. Where you didn't speak just to be heard. You spoke because your words carried weight. And if they didn't carry weight, you stayed silent. That silence wasn't emptiness. It was understanding. Understanding that energy is currency. That focus is protection. That every distraction has a cost. That's why our ancestors walked slowly, deliberately. Why their eyes didn't dart, but observed. They were reading the world. They were decoding nature. They were listening to the unseen. That's not ancient. That's eternal. And we're not trying to go back to that. We're trying to bring it forward into our minds, into our choices, into our responses. Because to be stoic in a loud world is revolutionary. To be calm in a world addicted to chaos is rebellion. To choose order in a world built on disorder, that's legacy. That's legacy. Not a brand, not a buzzword, not a costume of culture, but a lived principle. Because to live with order in an age of disorder, to think with clarity when confusion is the currency, to master the self when the world profits from your instability, that is legacy reborn. The sage in Kemet didn't move quickly, not because he was slow, but because he was certain. He had studied his breath, his step, his presence. He knew his spirit had weight. He wasn't in a rush to be seen, because he knew the seen fades, but the rooted remains. And that's the difference between performance and purpose. You don't need applause when your actions are in alignment. You don't need to defend your choices when they're built on principle. You don't need to respond to every energy thrown at you. Because not all energy is worthy of your reply. They'll call you cold, unmoved, detached. But what they don't see is that your silence is strategic, your discipline is devotional, your peace is protected by choice. Because you've seen what happens when emotion rules the day. You've seen kingdoms fall behind impulse. You've seen families torn by pride. You've seen men throw away legacy in a moment of rage. So you stay still. Not because you're weak, but because you remember. You remember Kemet. You remember the temples. You remember the scrolls. You remember Ma'at. You remember the ancestors. And you remember yourself. And so you walk through this world not as a reaction, but as a reflection of a deeper order. Stoicism, they call it. But before it had a name, it had a rhythm. And before it had a philosophy, it had a heartbeat. It was not born in Athens, it was born in silence, in the sacred stillness of the sun. So now, when you see them quote Zeno, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, know that the blueprint existed long before the translation. And now that you've remembered it, it's yours to live, to walk in, to carry forward, not just for show, but for soul. Because the ancestors are watching, and the future is listening, and the present is yours to master. Be unmoved, be disciplined, be divine.